Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for being here. Well, today I'm going to show the conversation that I had with Steve Wolfgang. I've told you about that before. As you watch, or perhaps you've noticed, let me start there. Perhaps you've noticed that when I said I tend to lean to the left, that's because of my Parkinson's disease. Leaning to the right would be better because of my philosophical standpoint. But I don't have a choice. But I really noticed it in this conversation that we had. But fortunately, Zoom displays opposite from the way we were sitting, so I'm actually going to be leaning to the right today. So I'd like us to begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll show the video. Our Father, we thank you for the opportunity to study, to think, and to do your will. We thank you that you've given us your will and word and promises and the great salvation we have in Jesus. Help us to walk carefully and closely with Jesus all the way. Be with us in our studies, that we can honor you and be careful with your word. We thank you for your many blessings and your wonderful grace. In Jesus' name, amen. And I want to thank Parker Jennings. He helped us in the recording of it and in showing it today. I'm going to have a conversation with Steve Wolfgang. I want to take just a moment to introduce him to you. He is a Christian. He is a member of the Downers Grove. He's a member of the Downers Grove Church of Christ, which is in the Chicago area. He is a preacher. He's a trained historian. He has a couple of master's degree in history and a doctorate. He's spoken in all kinds of lectureships and conferences. He's organized several meetings to discuss, especially restoration issues in a healthy way. He's written extensively about many dimensions of restoration. So thanks for being with us, Steve.
Thank you, David. Glad to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Did I get all that bio stuff right?
Yeah, that's correct. No problem. I taught history at the University of Kentucky for near 20 years, and a couple places before that. I do some work up here at the University of Chicago, actually in their archaeology museum, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Culture. So I'm in some ways broad-based, but my PhD's in history of science and technology. I did some work on Darwinism and so forth. So most historians study broadly. I mean, history is arguably the broadest of the liberal arts in that you can write a history of nearly anything. So anyway, that's the background.
So in an interview I was listening to that you had with somebody else, the subject came up about what historians do, and that is you tell what happened. But there is always interpretation because history telling, like anything, is selective. You can't tell everything that happened, so you have to select the things you'll talk about. So if you'll talk just a moment about how you fairly interpret what happened.
Okay. Yeah, and if your listeners are interested, I did an article actually on this subject called Finding God in History. I don't know if you can see that. It was in a special issue of Truth Magazine where we had a lot of people talking about, Josh Gertler talking about God in science and Matt Bassford on God in music and so forth. And so I was asked to address this question. I mean, history is at least about four things. I mean, it's whatever actually happened, whether we can know that or not, whether anybody observed it or whether anybody left records of it. And then secondly, the material evidence from that time. What are the artifacts, the inscriptions, the documents, letters, after action reports, eyewitness testimony, and so forth. And then of that, the records that have survived. Not everything that gets recorded about an event survives through history. A lot of historical documents we know existed only because somebody else referred to them. And finally, these secondary accounts by historians where as you say, nobody can write everything about everything. We're all selective in what we choose to use as evidence, the questions that we ask, and so forth. But history is about trying to locate what happened with a minimum of spin on it. I mean, everybody has an interpretation, an agenda, but I mean, history is not fiction. We're not just making this up or hopefully just selecting certain facts that support our preconceived notions. A good statement, I think, is you follow the evidence wherever it leads. If it doesn't take you where you think it ought to go, that's fine. A friend of mine used to tell the story about talking with his wife and about his work as a historian, and she would say, "Well, they shouldn't have done that." He's like, "Well, no, they probably shouldn't have killed all those people and stolen the money, but as a historian, it's not my job to say what they should have done. It's to say what they did do." So, yeah, and to do that with a minimum of intrusion of my own personal views or my agenda. You want to keep that out of the story as much as possible. It's not always humanly possible. Everybody has I guess, a take on something, but generally you want to let the characters speak for themselves and certainly not put words in their mouth or try to spin it a certain way. So,
So I'm not a professional historian, but I've done a lot of reading. I've read a lot of things you've written, Ed Harrell and others. And so I want to just review for my class what I've covered briefly to set the context for what we will discuss today. So I introduced the restoration idea, and I think a quotation from Ed Harrell might be the best I can do. This was in the period of the Great Awakenings. During the period of religious enthusiasm and ferment around the turn of the 19th century, numerous protests and reform movements broke out in the restless young American nation. The central theme of several was an embattled plea for the restoration of New Testament Christianity as a basis of Christian union in such diverse places as New Hampshire, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. New prophets of the ancient order began seeking the elusive dream of many Christian reformers, the rebirth of the primitive church. They generally conceived that this would be possible if all would wear the name Christian or disciples of Christ and return to the pattern of the first century in doctrine, worship, and practice. So we covered that period of restoration and brought it to America with the Stone Campbell movement, and then to the division between the disciples of Christ and the Christian church and the churches of Christ. And then in one lesson, I covered the sect to denomination process, which was really interesting and new to most people. And then I had a lesson on the wild democracy, as Ed Harrell called it. I don't know if he came up with that term himself, but the wild democracy of churches of Christ in the 20th century. And we covered the prominent issues of pacifism, premillennialism, institutionalism, and how that movement was impacted by strong personalities and influential positions that people had. So, this brings us to what I want you to talk to us about today, Steve. Both you and I are counted among the non institutional groups. Uh, and I want you to talk about that, but put that in the setting of the churches of Christ in the closing years of the 20th century, about 1970 or so.
all right, I'll try to do that in just a few minutes. I know we're time limited, but I'm glad you mentioned Ed Harold, though, who is a mentor to me in many ways. We used to see each other several times a year when we go to professional media, American Historical Association or the American Academy of Religion, American Society of Church History. These are all professional organizations that meet every year and move around from, one big convention city to the other, New York, LA, Chicago, what have you, Atlanta. So we would see each other in that context, in addition to seeing each other at gospel meetings and lectureships and so forth. And I once said, Ed and I did conferences together and read papers and so forth. And I once said he was the surrogate older brother that I never had. I'm the oldest in my family, so I never had an older brother. And so I appreciate his work. I still miss him, as a matter of fact. And to the point that you're making, and again, I'll mention a resource. I was asked to do a couple of appendixes in L.A. Stouffer's book. I don't know if you can see that, but L.A. has a book on the Restoration movement that goes up to about the time that you mentioned, the late 1960s, and then he didn't go beyond that. And so when they republished it last year, they asked me to write, or 2 years ago, they asked me to write a couple of chapters that finished out the 20th century and then went into the 21st century. And of course, what has happened is the same in the late 20th century, churches of Christ went through the same three, what I call the tripartite, the three-way division that happened with a century before that with the instrumental music controversy, where you had a large, out of the Restoration movement of the 19th century, the Stone Campbell movement, as generations came and went, and you mentioned the sect to denomination process. That's just a fancy sociological, technical way of describing. The way I would put it is, generations over time change their focus and change the kind of religion that they want off. And not everybody, not there are always individual exceptions, but as a whole, the religion that a certain, third, fourth generation wants is not for example, the end of the 19th century. They're not on the frontier anymore. Instrumental music is being introduced. Nobody had it much before then, not even the denominations, but it gets introduced largely in the 19th century, and so churches divided. And most of the churches went with the instrument, for example. But then there was of that, and probably 90%, I mean, 85 to 90% of the churches adopted instrumental music, supported the missionary society. Again, these were things that had not been practiced before, but they began to be introduced. And there was a small minority, antis, they were called, because they were anti-instrumental music. They were anti-missionary society, and I don't like that kind of describing somebody for what they're not or what they don't do, but that was those are the labels that were used. And then the 90%, 85 or 90%, a generation later, they split into two different groups, so that you get the disciples of the Christian church, disciples of Christ, which becomes a full-bore, full-blown, avowed denomination. They don't deny it. They like it. They call themselves a denomination. They're in the ecumenical movement. They adopt all of these sort of ecumenical kinds of ideas. But there were some people that went along with the instrument who said, no, that goes too far. And so they sort of broke out. So if you mapped them across a spectrum, you'd get my far left group, and then the far right group would be the non-instrumental, non-missionary society, and then there's this middle group that was sort of a halfway house, if you will. Well, that tripartite three-way division is what happens in the churches of Christ of the 20th century. In the 20th century, they grow from this small 15% minority, and they kind of go their own way. They don't have anything to do with these Christian churches, either the independent, middle-of-the-road Christian churches that didn't support the missionary society. They thought it was too liberal, but they did use instrumental music, so they're kind of a hybrid. They're sort of a halfway house. And then you've got the far left, kind of in anything. That's not fair to say anything goes, but they're progressive and left-leaning and much more elastic and permissive in what they would allow. And the 15% actually grows over the course of the 20th century, so that by the end of the 20th century, those three groups are roughly equal in size, because the disciples are shrinking. And in fact, that continues even into the 21st century. The disciples, like a lot of the old line, standard, ecumenical, mainstream Christendom, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, they're all bleeding members and shrinking and dying, and they're not being replaced. And so while they're shrinking, the far right, the churches of Christ in the 20th century, become very evangelistic, and they're baptizing people. And even though they're kind of shoved to the side, and they're meeting in storefronts and over the hardware store and kind of on the wrong side of the track, you probably have talked about this. They grow, and then they begin this development of, call it sect to denomination, if you will, but they start building bigger buildings. They get more socially prominent. The preachers are more educated. The members are making more money. They're building bigger, nicer buildings. And that happens in the late 20th century, so that by the time you get to the end of the 20th century, you get among churches of Christ these progressive groups, and they use that term. Sometimes they'll say grace oriented, and I don't have time to unpack that, but they like that term. As opposed to legalistic, as they portray people on the right. Of course, legalism is not a biblical term, so you can define it however you want to. I mean, it's a nice way to label somebody in a kind of a negative way. I mean, it's almost as bad as calling them anti, I guess. You call them legalists. Whatever that may mean, it's as I say, not a biblical term. So you get this three-way division in the late 20th century that produces a progressive, and just to identify some, for example, Pepperdine University, Abilene. These would be people that have no qualms about using instrumental music in some of their chapel services or otherwise in some of the churches that support them. Fully into women preachers, have changed their stance on that. In some instances, and I think increasingly the same arguments are used to justify they used to justify, for example, the inclusion of women and so forth. Now to include to recognize LGBTQ trans people as fully participatory in services, in preaching, and so forth and so on. Some of them are not quite there yet, but it's pretty clear to me that's the direction that they're going. So at the beginning of the 21st century, you now have this pretty clear three-way division among churches of Christ. Same thing that happened in the late 19th century among the Restoration Movement, Christian church disciples on the left, independent Christian churches in the middle, churches of Christ, non-instrumental on the right. I see the same three-way tripartite division occurring into the 21st century among churches of Christ. And so that's sort of the general lay of the land. And again, if you want way more detail on that, you can check out LA's book with the last two chapters that I document a lot of this. It's heavily footnoted, and you can find all kinds of other information that kind of supports this very broad brush picture that I've painted in the last, 10 minutes maybe. So there you go. A lot more to say. I've left out just too much stuff, but that's the general kind of lay of the land, if you will.
Well, define for us just briefly and concisely the mainstream viewpoint.
Okay. The mainstream, or what, I don't know exactly know what's a fair way to call them, would be people in churches of Christ that would say, all right, orphanages, church supportive institutions, church supported parachurch. That is, parachurch meaning they're not really a part of the church, but they're kind of attached to the church in terms of funding. So orphanages, homes for the aged, homes for unwed mothers, all of the things that the 1950s controversy started with. And it started with orphanages. I mean, there was an emotional appeal to supporting orphans that was easy to pull at people's heartstrings. Some people, like in the 1940s, right after World War II, tried to say, and did say, well, that you can support colleges on the same basis. The phrase was, the college and the orphanage stand or fall together. They have the same amount of biblical support. And I agree with that on one level. I think they don't have any biblical support. I don't think either one of them has biblical support. So I would agree with the statement. But N.B. Hardeman, for example, was trying to get funds for his college, Freed-Hardeman College, saying churches ought to support us. And since you've been supporting these human institutions that we call orphanages, why can't you support a human institution called a college? Well, in 1947, that didn't quite fly yet. There's still a kind of an anti-intellectual, nobody's really in favor. There's no emotional appeal to a college. In fact, colleges can be seen as kind of elite. most people before World War II did not go to college, maybe only 10 or 15% of the population. But after World War II, you get the GI Bill, and a lot of the returning soldiers now have funds to go to college, and all sorts of teachers' colleges are springing up. Normal schools become universities. Some of the institutions like Abilene or Pepperdine now expand their student base, and they're also taking church support. So that when Batzel Barrett Baxter in 1962 makes the same appeal, the college or the orphanage stand or fall together, there are a lot of people who bought into that. Now, Baxter is the head of the Bible department at David Lipscomb. He's also the national speaker on this big deal TV program called The Herald of Truth. At least it was at that time, back in the heyday of television. So he's a very influential figure. And when he comes out and says the college can be supported on the same basis as the orphanage can, that met a much more receptive audience. I think partly because of this sect to denomination kind of process of generations changing. People are more affluent. They're sending their kids to college more often. The colleges are booming. There's more money. We're not talking about the Great Depression and the stringency of World War II anymore. We got rationing and all of that. Now you've got this booming economy and things are growing. The church is on the march, as the phrase went. And so we're trying to build all these big churches. And so that was what the mainstream was. Now, what's happened is people have moved leftward and started to say, well, if we can support this, then we can support that. And the argumentation behind it becomes even more, I guess, progressive in one sense of looking at it. I mean, if you can argue, as some people did when they were defending orphanages and colleges, they would be honest enough to say, well, we do many things without Bible authority. We have all kinds of things we do without Bible authority. Well, once you start down that path, then you are on a trajectory that pretty much opens up, maybe not anything goes, but pretty close to it. I mean, I can have a conversation with somebody that I disagree with if both of us are trying to argue biblically or have a biblical conversation and say, this is what the script, no, the script is, we can talk about that. But if somebody starts saying, well, we don't need Bible authority for that, you might as well talk to the wall over there. I mean, there's not much basis for conversation. And so, for example, you mentioned some of my efforts in bringing these different viewpoints together. When I organized the meetings in Nashville in 1988 and Dallas, where we brought 50 speakers together and had hundreds of people in a hotel in downtown Nashville, or 2 years later in Dallas, because I didn't want it done in church buildings where we come just to have a debate. It was more a discussion type format. And we heard a lot of people, particularly in Nashville, saying if we want to build a family life center, we don't really need Bible authority to do that. If we think it helps our outreach to the community, we're going to do that. Or to hear somebody, and this is pretty close to you, one of these guys in one of the bigger churches up in the north side of Dallas, said, we didn't have the Bible for 400 years after the New Testament era, so, it was almost a Roman Catholic position that the church gave us, that we didn't have the Bible for 400 years, so we can kind of just do whatever it is that we please. Now, the two preachers that were preaching for these big churches of Christ back 30, 40 years ago, they're no longer in churches of Christ. They've totally left any restorationist idea. And as you get into that leftward drift, in some ways, that's the logical outcome of where that kind of thinking leads to. So that's a long answer to your question about the mainstream, but there you have it, all right?
So you have the non-institutional or more conservative churches that are continuing. So what would you say was their status
Yeah, that's an
in the last?
interesting question. And let me just start with the label, which I don't like because I don't want to be known for what I'm not. But it also isn't really even accurate. I mean, I believe religious institutions, have a right to exist. I attended Florida College and, half a dozen other universities that I have degrees from, but I went to FC. My children went there. I met my wife there. I write for a paper that I just gave you an indication of. That's an institution, but these are not church-supported institutions. These are institutions that are individually supported. And what I tell people is if you don't want to read the paper, you don't want to send your kid to Tampa, to Florida College, then you don't do that. There's nobody saying you have to do that or it's the work of the church to do that. So, as people sometimes will point out, well, you NI people, you have institutions. Well, we, and defining who we is always the big question. Yes, there are these institutions. Sacred Selections is an institution that facilitates people to adopt children, which I and nearly everybody else agrees is the better way to do it than putting them in a warehouse somewhere, putting them in an orphanage that is often rife with all kinds of abuses. So Sacred Selections is an individually supported organization. They will not take funds from churches. Neither does Florida College. Neither does Truth Magazine. Neither does Symphonical Songs that's produced by Symphonia Productions. But we don't take church funds for that. We don't accept donations from churches. It's entirely supported really as a business enterprise. We market a product and we get a printer to print it, and then we sell that to churches. So nobody's obligated to support it. So individually supported institutions, yes, but non-institutional, NI, in the sense that I don't believe it's correct or biblical for churches to be funding all these institutions. They need to be doing their own work and so forth. So that's sort of my take on non-institutional and what that means. So it's not that we're saying institutions are totally wrong and unbiblical. The question is it the job of churches to support it, and ought churches to be pressured into sending monthly donations to these institutions? I don't mean buying a service from them like you would buy electricity from the light company or heat the building by paying the gas company, whatever it is that you use. Those are business enterprises. But just to make monthly donations, I mean, is it the job of the church to send a donation to the electric company? No. So lots of issues involved with the whole idea of non-institutional. I hope that covers what you wanted me to talk about there.
So, a lot of people in the mainstream, some people in the mainstream, and a lot of people in the progressives thought the non-institutional churches would just die out,
No,
but they didn't.
no.
So, why do you think that was?
Well, I think it's the same, as I say, part of this tripartite pattern that if you start with churches that are sort of kicked out of the mainstream and told to go play in the traffic, basically, we would rather have our institutions than to have the fellowship of people who are conscientiously opposed to it and don't think it's biblical. And you sort of kick them to the curb. They might die. That was kind of the hope that I think some people had in the 1950s, is that these pesky antis would just sort of go away and shrivel up and die. But lo and behold, like the non-instrumental churches in the late 19th, 1890s, early 20th century, they became very evangelistic. Almost had to. I mean, you're kind of fighting for your life here, and they were sort of bent evangelistically in the first place. So they continue to grow and continue to develop. Although, I mean, arguably, David, you could say today that among non-institutional churches, I think I'm starting to see some of the same signs of this maybe three-way division starting to develop again. But that we don't have time to get into that probably today. So, what's
So,
your next
but
question?
what has happened? I think all many non-institutional churches have had people to come to them from institutional churches,
Yeah.
uh, because
Well, for example, I'll just tell you what I know up here in the Chicago area. Where we meet is 4 or 5 miles from one of the largest, although they've been shrinking also, as well as some other churches, but one of the largest, quote, progressive churches that has not just, the walking track and the coffee bar and so forth and so on, there for a while took baptism down off of their website. And when people move up here, and from, Texas or Arkansas or Kentucky or wherever they come from, and they're looking for a church, and they go there because they know of it. It's kind of maybe in the Pepperdine orbit. One of the preacher was there when I moved up here 17 years ago, had come from Pepperdine, and they go and they hear this pretty, what's to them, coming from conservative, middle of the road, mainstream churches, maybe more oriented toward, say, Freed Hardeman College or Faulkner or some groups like that that maintain still a fairly conservative approach to the Bible in some ways. They hear a lot of things that they've never heard before, and they kind of go, "I don't want that," or so they wind up sometimes over at Downers Grove. Now, we also have people that don't like the kind of preaching that I do, and it gets a little too stringent for them. Some of them might say legalistic, and so they wind up going to the more permissive groups. So there's a lot of back and forth in some ways, just like there was in the 1920s and 30s, that you get this shaking out of the wild democracy, as Ed put it. And you ask about it, that's actually there's a background to that. There's a book called The Democratization of American Christianity by Nathan Hatch, who's a historian. Ed and I both knew, but he's probably the guy that phrase grew out of. And his point was, and he uses some of the early Restoration figures to say that this was something where everybody was challenged to observe individual conscience and congregational autonomy, and not to be directed by a hierarchical archbishop or somebody at headquarters somewhere or something like that, that everybody had to take the responsibility in the early American Republic in the days of Stone and Campbell, and even before that, Abner Jones, Elias Smith, and so forth, James O'Kelly. All these individuals were working their way out of denominations by doing their own study, and I don't agree with every conclusion they drew. But I wonder sometimes, would I have done as well as they did if I were in their circumstance? Would I have been able to study my way kind of out of the denominational swamp, if you will, and say, this is what the Bible teaches, and so I'm going to take my stand here. So the idea of democratization, that is, that everybody is responsible for their own religious decisions and who they associate with, and shouldn't be decided for them by somebody in a hierarchy or somebody with his collar turned around backward or something like that. So that's the whole idea of and it can be a wild democracy where you get all sorts of weird ideas. I mean, Ed once said that sometimes in conservative churches you get all the nuts and kooks, but then he said, "But God deliver us from the alternative," which is kind of everybody just makes up his own religion. And you asked me in the material that you sent, is it, I don't know if we want to move to this now, but can we, forget how you put it, is the New Testament is the plea for New Testament Christianity valid? And I think we've got just a few minutes here, but my response to it would be, well, what's the alternative? I mean, if we're not going to try to be biblical and follow the Bible as much as we can, and that involves making some decisions, does that mean we're all going to become like Amish and say we're restoring the dress patterns and, well, whatever, what is that? How would we know that? Or are we going to try to follow the worship and the work and the organization and the details that we can read about in the New Testament and follow that as closely as possible, so that we're not trying to everybody make it up on your own? And I've sometimes said, talking about this, that, if I wanted to build my church, the church of Steve Wolfgang, so it'd be kind of like in Robert Bella's book, you may remember, where he's studying the sociology of religion, he describes a woman who said her religion was Sheilaism. And you can, of course, guess what her name is. Whatever Sheila wants to do is whatever her religion is. Or as Mark Twain said, what's good is what I feel good after, and what's bad is what I feel bad after. I'm just going to go with my feelings and so forth. And yeah, if we're not going to try to follow as closely as we can the New Testament as far as I understand, I can understand it, then we're just going to make this stuff up. So in Steve's church, I'd have instrumental music, for example, because I like that, and I wouldn't mess around with a dinky little piano. I'd have me a 110-piece symphonic band and a chorus that'd make the Mormon Tabernacle Choir look like a junior high school chorus. I'd have like Phil Spector's wall of sound going on. I mean, because I like that. Now, I also like a cappella music. I mean, I'm not opposed to that, but the point is, the reason we don't use instrumental music or have the choir and the orchestra where I preach is not because that's what I like. It's not my church. God didn't ask me what I liked. So I'm either tasked with trying to determine what does the New Testament teach, and am I going to follow that as closely as I can and try to decide what is it that God is telling me to do in terms of how to worship and who to associate with and what kind of lifestyle I should live, what kind of moral issues I need to make decisions about. If I'm not going to do that, then I kind of am left just to make it up as I go along and do kind of whatever Sheila wants or Steve wants in this case. So that's kind of my answer to that question. So I think it is possible to do that. And it is a kind of a heady experience in some ways to free yourself from every religious commitment that you have and follow Jesus only. And that means, of course, finding other believers who believe that that's the path and who are willing to worship together. So that is what the restoration movement is, to try to go back to the Bible to, as far as humanly possible, to restore the worship, the early beliefs of the early church and how they practiced what they did as a church. Were they into all kinds of social issues, or were they a spiritual institution focused on bringing people to Christ, convincing them that He is the only way through which we have the forgiveness of sins, that He is the way, the truth, and the life, that He is the path to true greatness, that He is the path to eternal life, as a matter of fact. That's the task of guiding people back to Jesus and to His church, which He tells us a good bit about in the New Testament, and then commissioned His apostles to model that for us and to give some correction to those who kind of strayed from the path a little bit. So, David, I appreciate what you're trying to do with this. And if you have any kind of closing questions, I don't know how much time we have left, but I think
I
Tom.
think I think we have about 5 minutes. So I wanted to pursue something about this emergence of the Church of Christ denomination. So I got 50 copies of this,
All right.
and people have read it. So do we acknowledge and admit the reality of it? I think you've already said that. So can we find ourselves in the process? And if we find ourselves somewhere where we really don't want to be,
Yeah.
can we counteract that?
Yeah. I think that is an individual decision. I mean, I've talked about this before, as we've talked several times in the course of you doing this class. Um, I do think there is a natural tendency that goes all the way back to the book of Judges, that successive generations arise that they did not know Moses, they didn't know Joseph, they didn't know the story. They might have known the story a little bit, but these were not real people to them. They're just names on paper. They might as well have been Adam as far as that goes. And the same thing happens, I think, in our own contemporary history. Things change over generations. I mean, your kids are not going to want to they're not going to like the same music you did, and so forth. They're going to change. And people who grew up on the frontier in the 19th century, by the time you get to the late 19th century and you got urbanization and industrialization, all the immigration that's going on, they tended to want many of them, a different kind of religion. Now, were there individuals in this process that said, no, I want to resist that, of course. And that's what I have to be. I can control what I do. I don't want to be involved in a process that takes me away from the New Testament. But how much control do I have over everybody else around me? I mean, if everybody else is kind of headed in that direction, I can't necessarily stop that process. I might be able to slow it down a little bit by doing what you're doing, which is teaching about it and educating people. I mean, the old biblical phrase, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, is as true today as it was when the prophet spoke. But I don't have responsibility for what everybody else is doing around me, and I can't stop that. What I can do is make my own individual decision. So again, I'm back to the right of individual conscience and congregational autonomy. I can make decisions about who I want to work and worship with and do my best to find a group of believers that is behaving and believing in ways that I think are consistent with the New Testament. So yes, as an individual, I have responsibility to guard my own thoughts and actions and to keep my thinking as undenominational as possible. Otherwise, I'm likely to get caught up in this general drift of the, call it sect to denomination, call it generational change, call it conforming to the world. I mean, the world does put tremendous pressure on Christians to compromise, to be less than what the New Testament teaches. And when you get that happening with large groups of people or with churches, then they tend to drift off and become more and more like the culture. And I can either make the decision to resist that and not participate in this developmental process, call it sect to denomination. I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but it's more a technical kind of sociological term that kind of turns people off sometimes. When I think all it's really describing is this generational change that's brought about by the tremendous cultural and social pressures that the world puts on us to accept. I mean, if the world around is saying, "Hey, you need to accept LGBTQ people, or you're a bigot, or you're a legalist, or something, or you're bad, and we're going to take away your rights and privileges, where you're going to lose your tax exempt status. We're going to close your doors, or you need to accept women preachers because." And why is that changing in churches? Is it changing because people did some really hard-nosed Bible study and said, "Oh wow, look at all these passages that say women ought to preach. We never saw those before." Or is it changing because the larger culture has put all kinds of pressure, social pressure on religious believers to say women ought to be able to do anything a man can do? And in secular society, as a general rule, I think that's correct. But as far as the church is concerned, I think we are governed by some biblical principles that don't buy into the larger culture, and we have to resist that if we're going to be faithful servants of the Lord.
Okay, Steve, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to do it. Always good to talk about these things, and I appreciate what you're doing in trying to make people aware of some of these issues.
Okay, so our time's up. We're
All
going to
right.
say class is over.
All right. Thanks much. Always good to talk with you. Take care.